designing learning experiences, and it's been a learning journey generally. And I think when the team approached me to handle this session, it's something that's really, it made me realize, wow, this is something we actually don't really think about, we don't really think about how, when we design learning, we expect behavior change, but we don't really think about how that behavior change is going to be achieved in terms of how we are designing our learning. So I think this session is very important for anyone who's in the L&D space to understand how to improve your designs based on how the brain processes information and how it acquires and retains that information. All right, so moving on to one question for you. What's one thing, as a learner or as a designer, what's one thing do you think that helps people learn better? What's one? Relatability, okay. Real life scenarios, hands-on activities, that's true. Practicals, very important. Repetition, mental readiness, hands-on experience. So I think you've mentioned a lot of important principles already of how learning can be improved or what helps people learn better. So if you're mentally ready, then you're able to learn better. If content is repeated, if you're able to practice that content, then you're able to learn better. So I think we are sort of like in the same line, and we are sort of on the same page, I mean, when it comes to understanding, I see another one, learning techniques, which is so true. Learning techniques are also very important because you have to understand your audience, understand their needs, and then design your learning according to, what techniques you think will cater to different styles in the of learning styles in the audience. All right, so next thing, if you look at this quote, the brain is not designed to learn in classrooms, it's designed to survive. This is a very important quote because it relates to how traditional learning styles or learning design is based to happen sort of in the classroom. But the way the brain works or the way the brain functions, the brain helps us to think, to reason, to come up with, to respond to threats, to come up with solutions to problems. And so the classroom setting, or let's say just having a slides, for example, presenting slides to learners is not enough because then you're not optimizing the brain fully to its potential. So the brain is not designed to learn in classrooms because you're sort of like pinning it to only one way of operation, which is not which cannot really make learning impactful. So basically, the brain is designed to survive and experience different environments for it to thrive fully and for learning to occur. So what we learned today, one thing is that we'll understand key brain science principles that are relevant to learning. And so basically just looking at how can we optimize learning principles in designing learning experiences. Number two, we look at how we can apply neuroscience, which is brain science, in improving learning design as learning designers and instructional designers, and even those who are in the L&D profession, for those who are involved in learning strategy. So how can we improve learning strategy to be science-backed? And then we'll also look at how we can live with actionable strategies for L&D practice. So at the end of it, we look at, okay, so what have we learned and how can we apply this to our day-to-day L&D practice in our different organizations? All right, so when you think about brain science in learning and development, why does it matter? Why is it important? So organizations that prioritize learning and development actually end up performing better than those that don't. So when it comes to profitability, performance, you find that organizations that prioritize L&D perform better because they sort of train their workforce to be ready. So they have a ready workforce that is trained, that they have the skills to perform their jobs, than those who really don't prioritize learning, but still want or expect their workforce to perform. So one thing I think when you really think about the concept of, let's say, like, think about cars. Everyone knows how cars operate. Everyone knows, they know the engine, they know the steering wheel, they know when you need to brake and all that. So for even someone who's not a mechanic and you own a car, you can tell when there's something wrong with your car, right? But when it comes to designing learning, then you find that a lot of people don't really know how the brain works. So then how do we expect behavior change when we don't really understand how the brain works? So L&D, brain science in L&D is very important because it sort of helps us to design learning that is alongside the principles of brain science, so that it's, at the end of the day, we get results, right? So I'm going to read you a story. Sorry, I'm using two screens. So I'm going to read you a story on my phone about the leadership training that looked good but did nothing. Let me tell you a story about a company. So we'll call them a Frenova Group, right? They decided it was time to transform their managers into inspiring leaders. They pulled out all the stops. They flew in big-name thought leaders from South Africa who had, let's say, coach in their bio or on their LinkedIn. So it was a big deal. The training room was beautiful. There was custom banners, there was branded notebooks, even scented hand sanitizer. Lunch was a buffet spread that had jollof, chapati, chicken, all you can think of. And of course, there was a media team capturing every moment. And the social media hashtag was Lead the Afrinova Way. The 2-day workshop was packed. People laughed, shared ideas, even role-played tough conversations with way too much passion. One manager even cried. 6 months later, teams still avoided hard conversations. No one was delegating. Staff surveys showed zero improvement in trust. One HR officer from the team, let's call her Brenda, she looked around and she asked, wait, didn't we spend a whole budget line on this thing? She pulled up the feedback forms, looking at what the feedback was saying. Someone said, loved the energy. Another person said, the snacks were elite. Another person said, that leadership iceberg slide was fire. Can we do this again next year? Someone else asked. But when she asked, so what changed in your leadership style? It was crickets. There was no answer. What do you think went wrong in this training? When you really think about how we design training, or if we have, let's say, 2-day sessions or 3-day sessions, even weekly sessions, a lot of focus is on the content, right? So you find that Afrinova focused on delivering the content and not how the brain works, right? Not how the brain actually learns and changes. If their initial, if they wanted to realize behavior change after that function, then they should not have focused on the event. They should not have focused on bringing in the best speakers. They should have really focused on how does the brain learn and how does it change. So they assumed when you have great slides, when you have a great speaker, that means it equals to great leadership. But that's not how the brain works. The brain is not really a flash disk, right? It just doesn't absorb information and expect things to change without actually practicing that information. So most of what people learn, people forget within days. People forget within weeks. So I'm sure even after this session, there's some things you won't remember by the end of the day, right? So one of the strategies we are going to talk about is, and you've mentioned it, you have to repeat, you have to practice, you have to make sure that your content has emotion and connection, because people react to things that make them emotional. And then people have to feel safe for them to be able to actually say, oh, I did not know this, or I needed to know this, and they need to be able to communicate and speak. So if there's no if there's no safety, psychological safety, then people are not free to speak and say, oh, I did not know that, right? So let's look at why it's important to learn brain science in L&D, right? Why is it important to know how the brain works when designing learning experiences? So one thing is that it offers us evidence to support L&D strategies. It gives us evidence to support L&D strategies. Because brain science is scientific in nature, then it has evidence in terms of when you repeat, for example, content, when you practice it, then there's evidence that learners have actually learned. So using brain science in L&D gives us that evidence to support our strategies in organizations. And then another thing is that it helps us reflect and question current practices. So when you look at what you're currently doing and you already understand how the brain learns, then it makes you say, oh, okay, then maybe we need to change how we design learning and we need to align it to brain science strategies or principles in order for actual learning to take place and for that learning to be effective and that can be applied, and also that will lead to organizational changes. For example, if you're working in an organization, let's say a company that they're selling products, for example, and you have a sales team that you train, you actually want to see that after training them for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, they're applying that training to actual practice, and then that translates to more sales. So you actually want results, right? And then number 3 is, it is a way to break down cultural barriers. So no matter how different we are, no matter whether you come from Kenya, whether you come from Nigeria, whether you come from South Africa or Ghana, the brain sort of works the same way, right? So it helps us see, oh, okay, we have different people from different environments in this organization. Then how can we leverage brain science to make sure that we bring these people together to create a culture that is positive, that is healthy in the organization? So understanding how the brain works helps us to break down those cultures and make sure that we have a positive culture. We have a positive, we have this safety in the organization. People feel safe. People feel free to talk to one another without feeling like they'll be judged for how they think or the things they believe in. All right. So think of a training. So like I said earlier, we have done courses online. We have been in trainings that probably didn't work. Think of a training that didn't work well and think of one that worked well. Tell me what the difference was in the chat. One training that didn't work well and one that did. Even as a designer, you've designed a training and then maybe 2 weeks down the line, you're like, I didn't do my best in this training. So what made you realize that this one worked and this one didn't work? Okay, so we can see like anything that worked was relevant, anything that worked, objectives are clear, anything that worked, learners are able to practice even over time, and anything that worked, strategies used to deliver were diverse. Training that didn't work had participants easily distracted, correct? So meaning that it's also not emotionally charged for them to react to what you're saying, and so they are not paying attention. All right. Okay, so let's think of this quote. Knowledge has to be improved, challenged, and increased constantly, or it vanishes. I think some of these things have already been mentioned. So when you talk about learning that didn't work, the fact that you're not able to remember it, so you're not able to practice it. When you think of learning that didn't work, you cannot see the impact, of that training to the learners. So it really relates to the brain's elasticity, right? So the brain is sort of elastic, and you're going to look at this. You're going to look at neuroplasticity of the brain and how that relates to brain science. So if knowledge is not improved, if knowledge is not challenged, if knowledge is not increased constantly, it vanishes, right? So like I said earlier, there's the forgetting curve where when you're learning about something, 5 hours later, you may not remember all of it. 10 hours later, you remember even less. 2 days later, you probably forgotten 70% or 50%. So then if that knowledge you're giving your learners is not improved, if that knowledge is not challenged through, let's say, for example, problem-solving scenarios, if that knowledge is not increased constantly, where maybe you have one training in 3 months, then you have the next training in 6 months, then that knowledge vanishes. Learners are not able to retain it because then the brain sort of remains dormant and has nothing to practice on. So the brain is elastic in terms of the way that the more you challenge the brain, the more you teach it, the more you give it more knowledge, the more it's like exercising, and we'll look at that in a bit. It builds it and it actually changes. So the more knowledge you give the brain, as long as it's relevant, the more the brain changes and is able to sort of create new paths to absorb even more knowledge. All right, just like I said about exercise. So we have the brain's learning blueprint. Let's understand how the brain works actually. So if you look at this, what do you think is happening in this picture? I know it's obvious. First picture, the same person on the left side, he has just decided, okay, I'm going to change my body. I'm going to do something about this. I don't like how I look. Then second picture, this is after 100 days of consistently working out. So you can actually see the changes after 100 days. Like he has more muscle, he looks stronger, he even looks more confident. I mean, he's looking up. In the left picture, he's looking down. So he has more confidence in himself because he has dedicated himself to working out, and now he looks different. He's achieved his results, right? And he even gave himself a time frame and said, in 100 days, I want to change. I want to look different. So it's literally how, remember that the brain is literally just a muscle, like any other part of the body. So for your brain to change and get new information and retain that information in memory, you have to actually work it, right? And this is literally how you improve yourself as a person. So think about, we even say when you exercise, you feel better. And that connects to everything. When you feel better, you're able to pay attention, you're able to feel even clearer. And so the brain should be worked just like the body, right? You have to constantly, back to the original point, knowledge has to be constantly challenged for it to actually be impactful for learners. So you have to constantly bring in new information in different ways, even if you're saying the same thing, but in different variations, so that that learning actually sticks. So it's a concept of neuroplasticity, which you're going to look at next. So neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to adapt and rewire, and it plays a very crucial role in learning and memory formation and adapting to new situations and challenges. So when we learn something new, the brain sort of creates neural paths. And the more you continue challenging the brain with this information, the more those paths are strengthened and they become strong and they effectively rewire themselves. So it's literally physically changing to accommodate new information. And also in the process, it discards information that is not useful. So that's how you find that the more you learn and the more you're reading about things or watching videos, the more you forget what you are not constantly reading on. So let's say you get interested in neuroscience and decide to read on neuroscience for the next 1 month, right? This is going to be at the forefront of your brain. And whatever you had learned before is at the back of your brain. So unless you practice it and bring it back, then you're more likely to just remember, what you're currently practicing on. So neuroplasticity is actually the foundation of all learning. So learning isn't just about gaining information, it's about physically changing the brain, like I said. So the stronger you use the parts, the stronger you practice repetition, the stronger you design your learning with emotion, the more people react to that learning, and those learning parts are strengthened. So in L&D, this tells us that learners need to apply, reflect, and practice for those parts to be strong. Let's look at something before we move on to the principles of neuroscience and brain science. Let's look at the foundation of everything, actually. So attention and engagement is actually really important in shaping learning. So one response before, when I asked what made that learning, what makes people learn better or what makes learning impactful, there was the response on it, learners being easily distracted, right? So if you think about what's happening currently with the way social media is, for example, look at how, for example, personally, if I give my story, I find myself struggling so much to watch a movie for, 1 hour. So let's say I'll sit there, turn that movie on, but then in not even 20 minutes, let's say 5 minutes, I have my phone in my hand. So I'm watching, but I have my phone in my hand. I'm on TikTok or something. So when you're designing for adults, when you're designing learning for adults, you have to really consider how to draw their attention and how to keep them engaged in learning, because also as adults, you have so much going on. It's very easy to get distracted and forget and focus on other things. So you have to make sure that when you're designing learning, you have to really think of how am I going to make sure that these learners will pay attention and be engaged. And I want to play this video, but I don't want it I don't want you to really hear it. So let me reduce the volume. And then tell me what you think is going on, okay? So I'll play it without volume, and then you tell me what you think is going on. And then I'm going to play it with the volume, and then you also tell me what you think is happening, and then try and go back and relate. What is it that I missed when there was no volume compared to now watching it with full volume on? Let me just reduce my volume and play it. And if you can hear, please let me know so that I can work on the volume. I don't want you to hear. Okay. All right. Let me see in the chat. What do you think is happening in that video? Let's see. Let's see in the comments. A lot is happening in his brain. Distraction, imagination. He got scared. He was thinking about marriage and the responsibilities that come with it. That's a good one. A lot is happening as regards decisions he might want to make or his next steps. Okay. Now, I see a man who is in a happy relationship, listening to outside influences which affect his relationship and has to relearn and realize his relationship is good the way it is. Now, let's see what the video is about now. Let me share my sound here. Can you hear?
Think back to a really vivid memory. Got it? Okay, now try to remember what you had for lunch 3 weeks ago. That second memory probably isn't as strong. But why not? Why do we remember some things and not others? And why do memories eventually fade? Let's look at how memories form in the first place. When you experience something, like dialing a phone number, the experience is converted into a pulse of electrical energy.
All right, so you can see it's very different from what you thought. So it's actually talking about neuroscience and how the brain learns. So when you look at it, it just lets you know that learning is really about providing context, because if you don't provide context, then people will assume and make up their own conclusions, right? So you really must provide context when you're creating your learning, and you can create context in different ways, which we'll look at. So don't always assume when you're creating learning that all learners know and they understand, they know what's going on. I think that's also a very common mistake that we do as designers. You just assume that they know, and you don't think of the language you're using, the vocabulary you're using, just understanding your target audience and their needs. So it's really important to sort of think of everyone as a blank slate as you're designing. But I know also when you're designing for adults, you really have to sort of treat them as they come with the knowledge, but be very careful when designing so that you're not letting them fill up their contextual clues on their own. All right. So we'll move on to how the brain actually learns, okay? And you're going to look at some exciting principles, and I'm going to go quite fast because I see time is really running. I didn't expect that to happen. So we're going to look at active learning and how you can use active learning to improve your learning design. We're going to look at spaced repetition. We're going to look at emotional engagement, safe environment, and lifestyle factors, which is exercise, diet, and sleep, and how these actually affect learning. So looking at active learning. Active learning is basically learning that engages learners and where they're actually practicing and applying concepts, right? So it's not passive where they're just reading slides or just reading PDF documents. They're actually engaged in that learning because the brain actually remembers what it does, not just what it hears or reads, right? So it's very important that as you're designing learning, you make sure it's active and where you're giving learners opportunities to investigate, to think critically, to create, right? To solve problems and to struggle with complex questions. Also, like when you're designing your evaluation, make sure it's complex so that they're actually really thinking and using that, using memory to actually apply that learning, right? Neuroscience suggests that active learning leads to better knowledge retention. So of course, when you're involved, you remember better. And then remember those neural connections we talked about in neuroplasticity. It makes sure that those neural paths are strengthened, which in turn strengthens memory and retains knowledge. So let's look at what active learning looks like, actually, yeah? One of the ways you can incorporate active learning is case study analysis. So I remember one time I was enhancing a training for some entrepreneurs, and one of the things, in the courses, they had case studies that taught them maybe, for example, how a business failed, right? Or what led to a business failing and what you need to do. For example, you need to do proper market research before you launch a product or introduce a product to the market and things like that. So there was case studies based on companies that succeeded and companies that failed. And for companies that succeeded, they used, let's say, for example, like Airbnb, how they came up with the concept, Uber, how they came up with the concept. So these case studies helped learners analyze what actually the business, for example, Airbnb or Uber did to make sure that they were successful. So using these case studies makes learning real, right? So they're able to apply these concepts to real life experiences and they're able to learn better, right? So another thing when using case studies, you have to be very careful that these studies learners can relate. So in this course that I was enhancing, initially, like I said, they had used Airbnb and Uber, but then I had come in to now look at African case studies we can use. So I picked case studies from Kenya, picked from Nigeria and South Africa, just to make sure that these scenarios were actually real, right? And learners could actually relate to these experiences and say, oh, when they read about, let's say, Copia, for example, and what happened to Copia, they're like, oh, I know Copia, right? So just that knowing makes them even pay more attention to that case study, and they're able to analyze it and learn the concept of, let's say, doing your market research better. The next thing is discussion forums. I think we're all familiar with discussion forums. Discussion forums are online platforms where learners engage, they post their thoughts, they communicate with others. Discussion forums can be used when you're introducing a course for learners to introduce themselves and get to know each other before beginning the course. So discussion forums are really great because they really, like when I was doing my master's, I did online, and discussion forums are actually graded, right? And you had to actually go in, give an opinion on a scenario, and then respond to maybe 2 or 3 peers so that you get your grades. And I in the beginning, it was really hectic. I was like, oh, you have to do like 4 discussion forums in a month. I know a month sounds like a long time, but they were very intense because they had like a limit to the number of words you can, the minimum number of words you can post and things like that. And also having to respond to other people, meaning you have to read through what other people are saying and then respond to that. But at the end of the day, I came to find out that it really helped me because the way I understand is not the same way someone else understands. So I was able to see, oh, so this is what this person thought about that scenario. And it really helped me think and look at things differently and learn how others actually grasp information. So this is just like, it's like a screenshot of one of the discussion forums that we actually did. So how you structure discussion forums is that you have a scenario. So in this case, you have a scenario where we are supposed to discuss, we're looking at the Boston Consulting Groups and the new products and services they have. So we're trying to find the value and aligning innovation with competitive advantages of the business. So you have a scenario. Then you have the assessment instructions. in this case, other assessment instructions is like respond to 2 or 3 people, and then you're told how you're supposed to submit. So basically, this is what they look like. I'm sure if you're familiar with, let's say, Canvas, LMS, or Thinkific, LMS, they usually have a section for discussion. So make sure if you want your learning to be social, interactive, and to create that emotional connection between learners and also the facilitator, then you include discussion forums. They're really great to make people get talking and explore topics in different ways. Another one you have is problem solving. Problem solving or problem-based learning, let's say. So where you present problems and learners have to critically think to solve that problem. Let me read you a scenario, okay? So let's say you're a team leader or a manager. You are 2 days into a new role. You haven't received your system login. Your team hasn't added you to any WhatsApp or Slack groups, and your manager or whoever is, on top of you is in back-to-back meetings. So you feel lost and you're unsure what to do next. What should you do, and what do you wish could have been done differently? So this is a scenario you can present to, let's say, new managers or new team leads, where they are not getting support as a new employee, and putting them in that scenario makes them think about how they can solve that problem. So the learning task for team leads is to get into small groups of or pairs and discuss what they would do differently, so that a new employee or a new hire does not feel left out or does not feel not fully supported. So they should put themselves in the employee's shoes, identify the gaps in the onboarding process, propose what the employee should do in that moment, which is a realistic action, and then suggest how the company could improve the onboarding experience to prevent this from happening. So problem solving really helps learners to actually apply the knowledge that they have in solving real-world problems, and that actually works really well in, again, ensuring that memory is strengthened and those neural paths keep rewiring and changing and becoming stronger. And that impacts learning and makes it effective. And then one other thing is role play. Role play is where you actually put a learner in the actual shoes of someone going through a situation, and then them getting the chance to see how it feels to be in those shoes and how they can approach that situation differently if it was them. Let's look at a short video here, just to show how role play happens.
Hi, I've been trying to get in touch with your office to return these, but nobody seems to be answering the phone.
Have you tried emailing us?
Yes, I have emailed.
Okay, well that's all you can do. You have to email it through and someone will get back to you when they can.
And what would be the time frame that
well,
they're meant to
it's
get
up
back
to them.
me?
That's not in my department. I can't help you. You need to do it online.
So is there someone that you might be able to ask that would be able to assist?
Can't help you. It's all done online within our online team. I don't know what more you want me to do.
Is there, maybe you could ask somebody if they could help with this?
Well, no, because I'm the only one here and I haven't had lunch and I can't leave. So you're just going to have to go back online, wait for someone to call you and go from there. This isn't my area. If you want to buy something, I can help you.
Okay, this is terrible customer service. Is there not a manager or someone that I can talk to?
We do have an online chat room that you can lodge a dispute with, but I don't have anyone here that you can speak with.
Okay, well, I'll need to follow this up with someone then. Thank you for not being helpful.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That's not a problem. Have a lovely day. Bye. Hello, how are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Good, thank you.
I'm just wondering if I could return this, please. I've bought one for my husband on the weekend and he's already received it. So is there a possible that I could get a refund for that?
Yeah, absolutely. Had you lodged something online yet?
I did, but nobody seems to have gotten back to me yet, so I thought I'd just pop into the office.
Okay, sorry about that. Usually our turnaround is 24 hours, but I can definitely help you with that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just look up.
Okay, so even without finishing that, you can see that you have 2 employees role playing, one as a customer, one as someone who's supposed to receive customers and take care of their needs. And in the beginning, she's really rude, but in this scenario, she's taking care of the customer like she should. So role play helps employees helps learners to put themselves in the shoes in that scenario, and actually that makes learning stick. And then you have interactive quizzes. So interactive quizzes are actually quite common. We have tools like Kahoot. We have tools like quizzes that can really help you create quizzes that are interactive. If you're on an LMS, if you're designing your learning on LMS, you have drag and drop, you have multiple question, which is very common, but then you can mix all those elements to make sure that it's interactive. So you have gamified, which will look at gamification. So you can gamify your quizzes, make them interesting, have leaderboards for learners to actually see how they're performing, and make sure that those leaderboards are quite interactive, and you keep changing them so that it's not boring to always have the same person winning all the time. So make sure that you're using diverse techniques to make sure that your quizzes and gamification is as interactive as possible. All right. So let's look at the second principle, which is spaced repetition. We have talked about neuroplasticity and how the brain works, and how you have to constantly engage the brain and practice in order for learning to stick. So we had mentioned that the more a neural pathway is triggered, the stronger it becomes. So in this case, without even going into it, we are going to watch a video and learn about the forgetting curve and how quickly the brain forgets. But from that, what do you think is happening in this picture? When you just look at retention and days, who can interpret this picture?
Hello, in this episode, I'd like to talk about Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve. Back in the late 1800s, Professor Hermann Ebbinghaus was studying a lot about memory and retention, and he wanted to know how to improve retention over time. So what he discovered was that memories weaken quite rapidly, and there's a sudden drop immediately after the learning experience. And that has a lot to do with the way that we make the learning mean something for us. So how well we're able to make meaning from the learning and attach it to other things that we already know. He also discovered that the way that the information is presented and whether it matches our learning styles has a big impact on our ability to memorize it. And finally, he discovered that stress has a huge impact on learning and retention, because the more stressed we are, the less we're able to use our prefrontal cortex and the parts of our brain that are important with memorizing and retention. So what he did was he did a number of experiments to find out how to improve this. And it was interesting to see that in 2015, another team replicated a number of his experiments and found very similar results. So what he discovered was that it's all about spacing the learning in smaller doses and reviewing regularly over time. For example, after a learning experience, it's really important, perhaps the next day, to review the material and ask yourself, what have I retained, what have I remembered from the learning, and then to review the notes and the materials to boost that memory and remember all the stuff that you did learn. And then about a week later, do a similar exercise. Ask yourself, what have you learned, what have you retained, and go back to your notes and review the material. And then finally, after another month or so, ask yourself the same question, go back, review the material, ask yourself, what have you retained, and then over time, regularly review. Again, a good time to do it is 6 months after the learning, so that you're embedding the learning, and each time you're improving the retention and making sure that you get real value from the learning. So what I'd like you to do is to consider, as a manager or as a learner, is if you're doing any learning, to regularly review the material, because otherwise your brain will not be able to retain it. And if your people are doing learning, regularly review the material with them so they're able to retain it and you're ensuring that they're doing the reviews, because it's often too easy to be too busy to do this review process. And yet it's so fundamental to getting a return on investment. Because when it comes to learning, stay curious.
All right, so that's basically the forgetting curve and why we need to constantly review material and repeat information for learners to actually retain that learning. So when you think of spaced repetition in learning, what does it look like? We have content chunking. So content chunking is giving information in small doses, right? So this could look like scheduling modules and courses over several hours or days or weeks apart. Let's say you have a module let's say you have a course that has 4 modules, right? So you could space this and say week 1, have module 1, week 2, module 2, week 3, module 3. And also another way of content chunking is looking at reviewing your material and looking for opportunities to introduce, let's say, micro-learning. So where instead of having all this information in one place, you can remove some of it and say, I'm going to create a video instead, or I'm going to create an infographic instead and share it with learners on their phone. Because also another thing about learning for adults is that learning has to really be accessible. So you have to really make learning accessible for you to be able to integrate spaced repetition in your learning, right? Another thing is including a review, like we've said in the video, and like we've said before, you have to constantly review. And when you're, let's say, introducing module 2, please talk about what you talked, what was covered in module 1. So in module 1, we talked about this and this. In module 2, we will talk about this and this. So that helps learners to link that information together, and it gives them confidence, because when they look at something, when they read the review, they're like, oh yeah, I remember this, right? So it boosts that confidence to actually learn the next and to connect that information together and to make meaning of it. Another thing is problem solving, like we said, encouraging employees or learners to apply new skills repeatedly. I think one of the most common let's say excuses for this is we don't have time, you know, but I think that really goes back to how have you structured your learning? Because if you've structured it properly, if you've looked at your learning strategy and said, we want to achieve this, then we'll make sure that there's room for learners to practice that information that they're getting, because otherwise if they don't, like we've seen in the forgetting curve, 2 days later, 3 days later, they'll not be able to remember that information, and it won't really help them. Another thing is blended learning. So blended learning is where you have synchronous and asynchronous. So synchronous, you have maybe, for example, you have in-person sessions or live sessions like this, for example. So live sessions, and then you mix that with, let's say you share videos later on, or you share an infographic later on, or you share a case study later on. So let's say you introduce let's say you're creating a course that is blended. So you introduce the course virtually or in person, and then you send a case study for learners to analyze. And then after that, they'll do a video to see how that is being applied. And then maybe you have discussion forums to test a scenario and see whether they have learned anything from applying that knowledge. So when you have blended learning, it helps you're sort of repeating it in different formats without making it too obvious that you're repeating it. All right. Now let's look at emotional engagement and how emotion is important in helping the brain decide what to remember. I believe I had a story here. Just give me a second. Let me see where that is. Yes. All right. Let's look at how emotions impact learning. So here's a story. We have a trainer in Lagos delivering a very formal onboarding session over Zoom. You know the type, dark blazer, crisp shirt, camera on background, blurred, trying to keep things polished, right? Let's say sort of like me right now, trying to make sure everything is smooth. He's presenting he's presenting on company ethics, very serious stuff. Then, just as he's explaining the part about professional conduct and personal responsibility, his laptop slips slightly and picks up a loud, unmistakable fart noise. The trainer freezes. Everyone on the call is staring at him. Then someone unmutes and says, I think that came from the ethics department. The chat explodes with laughing emojis. Turns out the trainer had an old fart sound app on his phone for playing pranks on his nephew, and the app accidentally triggered when the phone slipped in his lap. But here's the best part. Everyone remembered the ethics session after that. People even started calling it the ethics and emissions module. That one hilarious, embarrassing moment made the session unforgettable. It had emotion, surprise, humor, and a little tension. So that emotional part about that made that learning lock in and people remembered it. So then how do you make sure that you are incorporating emotion in your learning? Storytelling, just like I've done right now. I've told a story about someone who had a bad experience on the training and how that helped learning lock in. So make sure you're telling stories, find creative ways to tell stories. You could tell stories in a video, you could tell stories in scenarios. Make sure that you're telling stories because stories help people relate to their personal experiences, and that sort of locks that emotion in. Another way of emotional engagement is incorporating challenges in scenario-based learning. I don't know how many are familiar with, just different tools, like let's say Articulate Storyline, where you can actually create scenarios, right? So make sure that your scenarios have challenges, because every good story has a beginning, it has a challenge, and then it has how that character sort of went around that challenge and tackled it. So when learners relate to those challenges, it sort of evokes emotion, which makes that learning stick, and it makes it unforgettable. And even if they forget it, it's after a very long time, because they will always sort of relate how they felt when they were reading it to that learning. And so they'll always remember it because they're remembering how it made them feel. And then visual design. Visual design is very important. As a learning designer or instructional designer, you really have to lock in visual design, because it's everything. It's very funny how visual design evokes emotion. So let's say, for example, let's look at this slide. So have a good look at this slide, right? How it looks right now. Let me go to the next slide, which has the same content, but presented differently. How does that make you feel? How does this slide make you feel? It doesn't look serious. Yes, it's not professional. It makes you indifferent to the topic. Very true. It makes you sleepy, disorganized, boring, correct? Uninterested, dull. Yeah, that's true. So you have to be very careful when you're designing your slides, when you're designing learning, because there's a way it makes your learners feel when they look at that material. If I look at it and it's professional, I will just want to engage and learn more. If it looks like this, then it's very easy for me to just dismiss it and think whoever did this is not serious. And so why should I even care about what they're, it makes learners care. The way you present information makes learners care about that information. And so retention and memory is improved when they care. Another emotional way of engaging, another way of emotional engagement in learning is feedback. In most cases, you want to give feedback in a positive manner, because there's a way you connect with the person who's giving you positive feedback. Positive feedback makes learners feel seen, right? And not just evaluated. I remember when I was doing my master's, and we had one of the facilitator lecturers. She would give such nice feedback, even when you feel like you didn't do your best. But she was always so positive and said, you've done a really good job. And it just made me want to do better, right? So giving positive feedback will evoke emotions of motivation and wanting to learn more. But if your feedback is negative, it sort of messes with the safety, psychological safety. And I'll be afraid, even I'll be thinking, now if I post the next time on my discussion forum and I get negative feedback, or if I get negative feedback on my assessment, so it will literally impact the brain in a way that it will hinder learning when you're thinking, I'm going to be judged, I'm going to be made to feel little. So you have to always make sure that when you're giving feedback, it's constructive and it's positive, so that your learners feel connected to you and they feel like they can actually express themselves. All right. Now let's look at safe environment. We've covered this quite a bit, actually. We've talked about safe environment and how psychological safety is really the gateway to learning. Let's watch this video and see how you feel about your work environment. Let it trigger your thinking and see, how do I feel about where I work? How do I feel about my work environment? Is it safe? Does it make me feel like I can be myself? Does it motivate me to want to be a better person?
Do you enjoy going to work? Maybe there are days you dread. Or maybe there are chats you love and meetings you loathe. Or maybe it's the other way around. What is your perfect workplace? A positive workplace might have different details for everybody, but the result should be the same. An optimistic workforce with employees who feel empowered and enjoy coming to work. It means more collaboration, creativity, productivity, and profitability. The happier people are to be at work, the better customer service will be. The better the culture, the greater your company's reputation and recognition. Everybody wins in a positive workplace culture.
your attitude or how you feel when you're going to work really impacts how you learn, okay? So you can imagine if you don't feel safe at work, if you feel judged, if you feel like you cannot be yourself, the culture is horrible, and you have these tons and tons of courses that they want you to do, you will literally not, let's say, concentrate or even pay attention, because inside of you, you're not happy, right? And I think sometimes as designers or instructional designers, you have to give yourself a break, cut yourself some slack, actually, because sometimes you may have designed the best learning. You have used, let's say you're using Moodle LMS, the best out of there. You're using Articulate Storyline to design your scenarios. You've done everything. Your strategy is on point, but then the learners are not happy. The learners do not feel safe at work. They are stressed. They are highly anxious. They come to work anxious. And then you expect them to complete these courses and actually perform at work. It's not possible. So it's really, really important to make sure that the environment at work is positive so that learners can actually retain that learning and enjoy the learning. So we are on the last principle, which is lifestyle factors. You know, when your body is active, your brain is able to retain information better. Remember, we talked about the brain being a muscle, right? And you need to exercise just like any other muscle in the body. So when you exercise and you have, great oxygen flow in your body, you're feeling fresh, you're able to pay attention even, and you feel motivated. But if you're slouchy and you're feeling heavy and you're not working out, your brain also just becomes slouchy as well and just lazy because you're not really working it. Let's have someone else cover diet. How do you think diet impacts the brain and how it impacts learning? What you eat, how do you think what you eat impacts your learning and your brain? Yeah, so basically food is fuel for the brain, right? Food is fuel for the brain. So what you eat, make sure you have a balanced diet to make sure that your body is functioning properly. Because if your body is not getting the nutrients, it's very direct. If your body is not getting the nutrients it needs, it's not going to work properly. And so everything else is affected, right? You're not going to be healthy, probably sickly, and all those factors affect how you learn, how you pay attention, how you retain information, and also, very important, motivation. Your motivation will be low because generally you're not feeling well. So it's important to exercise, have a great diet, and make sure you sleep. I know a lot of people say I'll sleep when I'm dead because, they are working hard and doing everything they can to, survive. But that's really working against yourself, because sleep is really important for the brain to relax and sort of run through the information that it has received and compartmentalize that information and make sure that you're actually able to remember it. Because the sleep, just like any other part of the body, cannot operate full time. At the end of the day, you go to sleep, right? Your body, and even people who don't sleep well, sometimes the body just shuts down, by force. We love to sleep. Yeah, so sleep is really important. It's actually very healthy. You're supposed to get your 8 hours, 7-8 hours, to make sure that you're functioning at optimum. So making sure that you're healthy and your brain can really, when you talk of those neural parts you're talking about in neuroplasticity, make sure that those neural parts are strengthened properly, because if they are not, then you're not able to retain information. You're not able to remember. You're not able to apply that information. All right. So, for the next bit, so you're reviewing, thinking of everything you learned today. You're reviewing, one second, you're reviewing a 1-hour Zoom session for new stuff titled Fire Safety 101. Here's what it currently looks like. 20 minutes, the facilitator reads the slide, right, with fire safety instructions. 10 minutes, they have Q&A. 15 minutes, they watch a pre-recorded video to talk about fire safety. Then 10 minutes break, and then they have a 5-minute end of session multiple choice quiz. Then one learner says, it was an okay session, quite boring though. So think about you as a designer in everything you've learned today. Choose 1 to 2 brain-based strategies from today's session to improve this training. Focus on how it's delivered, not just what's said. So you're choosing 1 to 2 strategies, proposing changes to that format. Be ready to share what change you made and what brain principle you applied. So thank you so much for being such active participants for today's session. I think we've learned a lot of new things that will help us design our learning better, or even just be better learners, in terms of, let's say, making sure you're taking care of yourself so that you're learning, you're making sure that you're healthy, you're eating well, you're sleeping better, so that you're also a great learner, because it's not only up to the learning to be engaging and effective. As a learner as well, you have to make sure that you're in the right mindset and you're healthy, yeah, to make sure that you're absorbing and retaining the information you're getting.